On a Saturday morning in April of 1986, at a farm equipment auction in Story County, Iowa, a man named David Coleman made what the dealer called a waste of money. He paid $880 for a 1947 International KB Series stake truck that looked like it had been abandoned in a field for a decade. The truck sat near the back of the auction lot, its green paint faded to a mottled gray-brown. The stake bed was warped. The tires were weathered and cracked. Rust had eaten through the running boards. Someone had written "Scrap Heap" in the dust on the hood, and nobody had wiped it off because nobody disagreed. The auctioneer moved through it quickly. 1947 International Stake Truck, sold as is, probably good for parts. Do I hear $500? Silence. $400. Nothing. Come on, folks, $300 and we move on. David Coleman raised his hand. $880. The crowd turned to look. A few men laughed. The dealer, a man named Jim Parsons who sold used trucks from a lot in Ames, shook his head visibly. "That's a scrap heap, friend," Jim called out. "You're throwing money away." David walked to the cashier, paid in cash, 8 $100 bills and 4 20s, and took his receipt without responding. Let me tell you about David Coleman, because understanding him is essential to understanding what happened next. David was 52 years old in 1986. He'd been farming the same 240 acres in Story County for 30 years, raising corn and soybeans, keeping a small herd of cattle. He lived alone in the farmhouse where he'd grown up, the same house his father had built in 1938. David had been married once, to a woman named Sarah. They'd met at the Story County Fair in September of 1963. Sarah had been wearing a yellow dress. David had been 29 years old, already convinced he'd never marry. Sarah had been 21, visiting Iowa from Illinois. They'd married in 1964, 22 years of marriage. No children, but they'd been enough for each other. Sarah had died in 1998 of ovarian cancer. She was 53 years old. David had been alone for 8 years by the time he bought the International truck. He bought it because he needed a farm truck for hauling equipment and feed, and $880 was all he could afford. The truck looked bad, but the frame was solid. David knew he could make it work. What he didn't know was what the truck was carrying. What had been hidden inside it for 40 years. What would make him question everything he understood about time, fate, and the woman he'd loved. But that discovery was 18 years away. First, David had to restore the truck. Let me tell you about those years, because they matter. David spent 2 years bringing the International back to life. He rebuilt the engine, replaced the transmission, welded patches on the bed, repainted it in the original International green. By 1988, the truck was running reliably. He used it on the farm for 16 years, hauling hay bales, moving equipment, making runs to the feed store. The truck became part of his routine, as familiar as his tractor or his barn. David never redecorated the cab. The original bench seat was cracked but functional. The dashboard was scarred but intact. He figured if it still worked, there was no reason to change it. Until the spring of 2004, when the dashboard started to fall apart. David was driving back from town when a section of the dashboard trim separated from the frame. The trim piece was held on with old screws that had rusted through. When it came loose, David could see behind it, into the cavity between the dashboard and the firewall. There was something inside. David pulled over on the side of the county road. He reached into the cavity carefully, expecting to find old rags or mouse nests. His hand touched paper, a lot of paper, bundled together. He pulled out a stack of envelopes, maybe 30 or 40 of them, all tied together with string that had rotted and broken. David sat in the truck cab on the side of the road and looked at the top envelope. It was addressed in careful handwriting, to David Coleman. His name, his exact name. There was no address, no stamp, just his name on the envelope. The postmark date made him stop breathing, April 15, 1946. David opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter, written in the same careful handwriting. It began, "Dear David, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you exist yet, but I know you will, and I know I'll love you." David read the letter twice. Then he reached back into the dashboard cavity and pulled out more bundles, more envelopes, all addressed to David Coleman, all postmarked between January and December of 1946. He counted them when he got home, 127 letters, all addressed to him, all written in 1946. David had been born in 1934. In 1946, he'd been 12 years old. Let me tell you what the letters said, because they're the heart of this story. David spread all 127 letters across his kitchen table and read them in order by postmarked date. The first letter, dated January 3, 1946, read, "Dear David, I'm writing to someone I haven't met. I don't know why I know your name. I just do. David Coleman. I know you're a farmer. I know you live in Iowa. I know you have kind eyes and strong hands and a quiet way of speaking. I don't understand how I know these things. I just know them the way I know my own name. I'm going to write to you, even though you're not here yet, even though I might be losing my mind. Maybe someday you'll read this and understand. Sarah." David's hand started shaking. Sarah, his wife Sarah, who had met in 1963, who had married in 1964, who died in 1998. Sarah had written this in 1946, 18 years before they'd met, 1 year after she was born. That was impossible. Sarah had been born in 1945. In 1946, she'd been 1 year old. David read the second letter, dated January 10, 1946. "Dear David, I know things about you that I shouldn't know. I know you grew up on a farm in Story County. I know your father's name was Robert. I know you had a dog named Duke who died when you were 10. I know you served in the army. I know you were stationed in Germany. I know you came home in 1956 and took over your father's farm. How do I know these things, David? I'm 17 years old. I live in Illinois. I've never been to Iowa, but I know you like I've known you my whole life. I'm not crazy, at least I don't think I am. Sarah." David set down the letter. His heart was pounding. Sarah was right. His father had been named Robert. He'd had a dog named Duke who died in 1944 when David was 10. He'd served in the army from 1953 to 1956, stationed in Germany. He'd come home and taken over the farm. All of that had happened after 1946. How could Sarah have known in 1946 what would happen in the 1950s? David kept reading. Letter after letter, Sarah described his life, his childhood, his time in the military, his return to Iowa, his years farming alone. She described things no one could have known in 1946. The scar on his left hand from a thrashing accident in 1958, his habit of drinking coffee at dawn while watching the sun come up, the way he talked to his cattle like they were people. And in every letter she said the same thing. I don't know how I know you, but I do, and I love you. The final letter, dated December 20, 1946, was different. Dear David, this is the last letter I'm going to write. I'm hiding all of them in the truck. I don't know whose truck this is, but I know you'll find them someday. I know we're going to meet. I know it will be at the Story County Fair in September of 1963. I'll be wearing a yellow dress. I'll be standing near the livestock barns. Please come find me, David. I'll be waiting. I don't understand any of this. I don't know how I know your whole life before it happens. I don't know why I've been writing to someone who doesn't exist yet. But I know I'll love you forever. Sarah." David sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by 127 letters written by his dead wife in 1946, 17 years before they'd met, describing his life with perfect accuracy before it had happened. He didn't sleep that night. Let me tell you what David did next, because he needed answers that didn't exist. David took the letters to a handwriting expert at Iowa State University. The expert compared them to samples of Sarah's handwriting from the 1960s and 1970s, letters Sarah had written to friends, grocery lists, birthday cards. It's a match, the expert said. Same person, same handwriting, but the ink and paper in these older letters are consistent with the 1940s. I don't understand how that's possible. David took the letters to a paper conservator. The conservator examined the envelopes, the paper, the ink. This is 1940s paper stock, the conservator said. The ink is iron gall ink, common in that period but rarely used after 1950. The aging patterns are consistent with paper that's been stored for 60 years. These letters were written in the 1940s. I'd stake my career on it. David asked the question he was afraid to ask. Could someone have faked them, written them recently but made them look old? The conservator shook his head. Not to this degree of accuracy. The paper fibers have degraded in ways that take decades. The ink has oxidized naturally. This isn't forgery. These letters are genuinely from the 1940s. David went to the library and searched newspaper archives. He found Sarah's birth announcement in an Illinois newspaper. Sarah Marie Henderson, born June 12, 1945. In 1946, when these letters were written, Sarah had been less than a year old. David talked to Sarah's younger sister, Janet, who was still alive and living in Illinois. He didn't tell her about the letters. He just asked about Sarah's childhood. Sarah was always strange, Janet said, even as a little girl. She used to talk about a man named David. She'd draw pictures of him. Our parents thought she had an imaginary friend. She insisted he was real. She said she'd meet him someday at a fair in Iowa. David's hands went cold. When did she stop talking about him? 1963, Janet said. After she met you. She came home from that Iowa trip and said, I found him. I told you he was real. We thought she was just being Sarah. She always had a vivid imagination. David drove to the Story County Fairgrounds. He stood where he'd met Sarah in 1963. He remembered that day clearly. Sarah in a yellow dress, standing near the livestock barns, looking at him like she'd been waiting her whole life. She had been waiting since she was 1 year old, since 1946. Let me tell you about the impossibility of this, because David spent 2 years trying to understand it. He consulted physicists. One suggested closed time-like curves, theoretical loops in spacetime where information could travel backward. But that's purely theoretical, the physicist said. There's no evidence it actually happens. He talked to psychologists about precognition and collective unconscious. There are documented cases of people knowing things they shouldn't know, one psychologist said, but not to this degree of detail, not writing 127 letters describing someone's life before it happens. He spoke to a priest. I can't explain it, the priest said, but I can tell you this. Love doesn't follow the rules we think it does. Maybe Sarah loved you outside of time. Maybe love is the one thing that can move backward. David read and reread the letters. He found details that shook him. In a letter dated March 1946, Sarah wrote, You're going to cut your hand on the thresher in 1958. Please be careful. I know you'll survive it, but it will scar. I wish I could warn you. In 1958, David had caught his hand in the thresher, 12 years after Sarah wrote that warning. In a letter dated July 1946, Sarah wrote, Your father is going to die in 1962, heart attack while plowing the North Field. You'll blame yourself for not being there. Please don't. There was nothing you could have done. Robert Coleman had died in May of 1962, heart attack, North Field, 16 years after Sarah wrote those words. David had blamed himself for years. In a letter dated September 1946, Sarah wrote, We're going to have 22 years together. It won't be enough. I'm going to get sick in 1996. I'm going to die in 1998. I'm so sorry, David. I wish we had more time. Sarah had been diagnosed with cancer in 1996. She died in April of 1998. 52 years after she'd written that she would. Every detail, every prediction, all of it accurate. David sat in his farmhouse, holding letters from a wife who'd somehow loved him before time allowed it, and he wept. Let me tell you what David did with the letters, because this is where he made his choice. He could have kept them secret. They were impossible to explain. People would think he was crazy or that he'd fabricated them. But David didn't care what people thought. He donated the letters to the Iowa State Historical Society in 2006, all 127 of them, along with a written statement explaining how he'd found them, where they'd come from, and what they meant. The Historical Society authenticated them. Paper analysis, ink analysis, handwriting comparison, everything confirmed. The letters were written in 1946 by Sarah Coleman, née Henderson, describing the life of David Coleman with perfect accuracy before the events occurred. The letters were put on display in 2007 as part of an exhibit called Mysteries of Iowa History. Thousands of people came to see them. Scientists, skeptics, believers, people who'd lost loved ones and wanted to believe that love could transcend time. The exhibit placard read, These letters have no explanation. They were written in 1946 by a 1-year-old girl who somehow knew the complete life story of a man she wouldn't meet for 17 years. Every detail she described came true. We cannot explain how this is possible. We only know that it is. David attended the exhibit opening. A reporter asked him, Do you believe Sarah could see the future? I don't know, David said. I just know she loved me before I met her, before she could walk or talk, before time should have allowed it. That's all I need to know. Let me tell you about David's final years, because the story doesn't end with the letters. David Coleman died in December of 2019 at the age of 85. He'd lived 33 years after Sarah's death. He never remarried. In his will, he left instructions: bury me with the last letter, the one where she says she'll wait for me. I'm ready now. The funeral director placed the December 20, 1946 letter in David's jacket pocket before closing the casket. David's headstone reads, David Coleman, 1934-2019. Loved by Sarah before time began. The remaining 126 letters are still at the Iowa State Historical Society. The exhibit has become permanent due to public demand. Scientists have studied them for over 15 years. No one has found evidence of fraud. No one has developed an explanation that makes sense. A quantum physicist wrote a paper in 2015 suggesting that consciousness might not be bound by linear time in ways we don't understand. If consciousness can exist outside the normal flow of time, he wrote, then perhaps love, the deepest form of conscious connection, can as well. A neuroscientist proposed in 2018 that Sarah might have experienced a form of temporal lobe epilepsy that allowed her to access memories from a future that hadn't happened yet. But that doesn't explain how those memories were accurate, she admitted. It just gives us a framework to think about it. A philosopher wrote, these letters prove that some human experiences cannot be reduced to mechanism or explanation. They simply are. People still visit the exhibit. They read the letters through glass. They cry, they take photographs, they leave notes. This gives me hope that my husband is waiting for me outside of time. I've always felt like I knew someone I haven't met yet. Maybe I do. Love is bigger than we think it is. The international truck is displayed next to the letters, restored to its 1947 appearance. The dashboard cavity where David found the letters is preserved behind plexiglass. A video plays on loop. David's 2007 interview, recorded shortly before the exhibit opened. The interviewer asks, how do you explain this? David, 73 years old, gray-haired, weathered by decades of farming and grief, looks directly at the camera. I can't explain it, he says. Sarah loved me in 1946. We met in 1963. She died in 1998. I found her letters in 2004. Those are the facts. How it's possible doesn't matter. That it happened is all that matters. Do you think she's waiting for you? The interviewer asks. David smiles. It's the first time in the interview he smiled. She said she would in the last letter. I'll wait for you. Sarah never broke a promise. Let me end this story where it began. At an auction where a man bought a truck everyone called a scrap heap. David Coleman paid $880 for a 1947 International that the dealer mocked. He used it on his farm for 18 years, and then he found what it had been carrying. 127 love letters from his wife, written in 1946, 17 years before they met, 1 year after she was born, describing his entire life before he lived it. Science cannot explain them. Logic cannot account for them. Time itself seems to bend around them. But they exist. You can go to Des Moines and see them. You can read them through glass. You can verify every detail. And you can draw your own conclusion about what they mean. Maybe Sarah was psychic. Maybe she experienced time differently. Maybe love exists outside the linear flow of past, present, and future. Or maybe, as David believed, some souls recognize each other across any distance, any barrier, any impossibility. The dealer called it a scrap heap. The scrap heap held 127 letters that defied everything we think we know about time. And the man who found them learned that the woman he loved had been loving him since before they'd met. Before she could speak, before she could write, before time should have allowed it. She loved him anyway. And somewhere, if David was right, she's still waiting.